Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be working on this, the Object 279 kit. We're going to get it all primered up, and then paint it with the nice AK paints. Today, we're going to be using some Protective K, as well as some NATO Green, just to add some little highlights and everything to it. But, before we do that, we're also going to be doing all of the 3D printed parts as well. But, before we do all of the paint, we got to primer it first. And we're going to be starting off primering the metal with just some nice little Tamiya metal primer. Now this stuff's brush on, so just kind of brushing it on to all of those photo etch and metal parts just to get them nice and good. Now this stuff really helps get all of your normal paints to stick well and go well onto those kits. As without it, you can have some chipping and some peeling, which can really cause some problems. Now, we're going to be doing the surface primer. I like to use this Vallejo surface primer. It goes on nicely and adds a nice flat finish to doing it, which allows you to see any imperfections that the kit may have and allows you to fix them. Now, priming the kit went pretty well. There was some issues here on these little vents where the primer was beating up and kind of covering them, but I just took a pin and poked all of the holes out, making sure they were all good. Then, of course, moving on to doing more primering on the rest of the kit, making sure to really get into all of those tricky track areas that have caused so many problems with this kit in the past. But then it's on to the turret, getting a nice coating on that, and then, of course, coating all of those extra details that left off of the kit that will, of course, be needing to glue on later. But keeping them off just makes them easier to paint up and get fully covered looking good. Now we're going to coat all of the details and the kit in a nice dark black coat. This will really help that green layer to look a lot darker and look a lot more like an actual Russian vehicle of the era. Now, we could have just done a black primer, but I didn't have any, so we're just going to coat it with black after the fact. And it works alright. It also allows us to put a nice coat onto those tracks because they'll of course need to be black. So doing that with the hull, and now of course the turret, keep making sure to get all of the areas, all of the little details, really getting in the dark areas, as this will also help to kind of pre-shade the model, make it look all nice once we have the green layer over top of that. Still working on the turret, getting it all good, covered, and of course that long barrel of this kit. Now, I'm really happy with how that barrel came out because it had a fair few imperfections on it, and with just a bit of sanding and puttying from the previous episode, it looks real good, all straight, everything's all good on it. Now with that black layer done over top of it all, we can move on to that nice AK green paint. And it's the exact same process as with the black, really. Just coating everything, getting into all of those areas, making it look all good. Now, I like to do, of course, thin coats, going over multiple times with the tank. And if your paints are thinned out right, you can kind of continuously go over it, working on the areas that are fresh, and then, of course, moving back to areas that you've missed in the past. Now moving lower on the kit onto all of that running gear and the track area, just getting in nice and close with the airbrush, being very precise, trying to get as much of the green onto the running gear and keeping it off of the tracks as possible. Now that won't matter as much as we'll be covering all of the underside of this kit in weathering details and everything anyway, so it should be fine. But now we're on to spraying these little details green, and with these barrels, I coated one of them black and left the other one in just the primer gray, and this will create just a little bit of difference and create a little bit of visual interest, being maybe one's an older barrel and one's a newer barrel. Now we're on to the tow cable on this kit, and this is a very nice tow cable, and I of course have primered it with the metal primer and the other primer just to get it all uniform. And then, since I usually cover these tow cables in a lot of rust effects, I don't really particularly try and get them completely covered and perfect, so I just kind of spray them on the table. Then we're on to using one of the other highlight colors we'll be using and spraying some of those details again, spraying them in all different colors, yet still quite similar, just to keep a little bit of a uniformity to the model while still adding some visual interest. Now we're going to start doing some post shading to the model, just using other colors of greens and Russian greens, all from AK, just to kind of add some more interest to the model and make everything look different instead of that one uniform green. So just doing it on all the raised parts, places like the turret, which of course look a little different, everything. And now moving on to the hull, doing the same thing, really just highlighting areas, spraying on raised areas, and just adding some kind of fake shadow and highlight effects. Now we're moving on to kind of the pre-weathering step, as I call it. Spraying a mix of browns and greens on the underside of the kit, really getting it looking muddied up and dark, and of course hiding some of the issues with painting such complex tracks in tight areas. Really just getting it darkened up and kind of helping to unify it before we actually do any weathering effects. And of course with this, as I ran out of paint, I would make more, but adding more and more browns as I went, just to kind of keep that darkening effect as we moved closer and lower down to where the ground is, and of course the source of the mud. Now, a lot of this will be covered up by weathering effects and all of the other grime and stuff that we're going to add in the next episode when we finish this kit, but this really just kind of helps to anywhere you've missed, so there isn't anything that in a missed area looks really out of place or odd, and just kind of really helps unify the model and bring it all together, I found at least. And as well, making sure to get in areas where mud would actually be, so in the back where mud would be flicked up by those tracks, just making sure to kind of coat it heavier than in other areas that wouldn't be affected as much. So now we're on to the little extra track pieces, and since these would just be sitting on the sides of the model and the tank in real life, we're just going to cover them in a lot of rust. If you look at old historic photos of when tanks had these tracks and extra pieces on them, a lot of times they did get pretty rusted out. So I'm just going to give them a nice heavy coat of the rust effects, just as a start. Then we're going to sprinkle some rust onto that darker of the two oil drums or fuel drums, just kind of making it look like it's a darker one. Then, after they're all painted and everything, we're of course going to be taking all of these extra details off of the skewers, as we don't need them on there anymore. And same with the tracks, being very careful to take them off, because as all the tracks are on this kit, they're quite fragile, and getting the last little one off. After that, we're just going to put a little bit of paint on the undersides. Now, of course, this won't look great, but since we glued all of the skewers on in areas that won't really be seen on the kit, it won't really matter because they won't really be seen. It's just in case there are some odd angles where you might see them, they're going to be color matched enough that it won't draw your interest into a problem. And now that they're all off and painted, we're of course going to be gluing them up onto the kit. Just adding a little super glue and putting them on, fitting them in right where they need to go. Of course, stacking those two ammo crates up on the back of the tank here with a little bit of glue and kind of fitting them up. And after we're done that, we're of course going to throw the turret back on, just kind of fitting it up, making sure it all still moves and works good and nothing interferes. You really want to make sure of that, or else you might not be able to get the turret back on your tank. And now of course throwing the oil drum on here. Now this first one of course just going on, kind of stunging it up to the other cans and kind of leaving it not too securely on there, just so when we put this other one on here, we can make sure to scooch them up together and make them look real good together. Now, going on to the final detail, that log that goes onto the back of the tank. Now, a lot of Russian tanks have this, and in a lot of things, the 279 didn't really have a log on it, but it never really entered service, so because this is supposed to be a 279 that actually entered service, I decided to just throw the log on there, gluing it on the back, kind of in an area that looks appropriate. And now we're moving on to removing that little bit of AK liquid masking tape that I put on in the last episode. Now I'm pretty impressed with this stuff. It did take a little bit of cleanup, and as you can see here, quite a bit of effort to actually get it pulled off, but that's honestly attributing to it being on such a small area, and I say cleaning it up a little bit here, getting it off, and it ended pretty good with having not much overspray or messing up on it. So with that, that's the end of this episode, and you can see this thing's finally starting to come together. With all the paint on it now and the pre-weathering on it, it looks pretty good. In the next episode, we're going to be getting all of the weathering done and finishing up this tank, really. We won't be adding too much. We're of course going to be adding on those track pieces that I haven't quite finished weathering up yet, so they'll be getting glued on in the next episode, as well as a ton of mud and dirt, even a little bit of snow effect, just to kind of help it fit in with the diorama we'll be building later on for this kit. So, thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and if you have any comments, feel free to comment. See you in the next one.